And here we go. So again, this is Parents as Partners. First time we've ever done a virtual conference. Very excited. We've had this conference for many years. I'm sure if you were at the first presentation, someone probably spoke to that, but it's quite exciting that we are doing this virtually. Quick reminder, we do have sponsors. Things like this don't just happen. So we have different sponsors and we'd like to give them a shout out right now. And you'll see them on the screen. I'm sure that you'll see them throughout the day or the weekend, depending on how much you're participating this weekend. This presentation is called, sorry, I'm just moving something over here. Sorry, thank you. This presentation is called Special Education, the IEP, the IPRC process, and the role of the parents. Basically, what I'm hoping to do today is to give you an overview of everything special ed and answer any questions around some of the processes that we have. And these are the specific things we'll look at. We'll look at what is an in-school support team meeting. We call that an IST, and a school support team meeting, an SST. One thing you will find in TDSB is we like to use acronyms. So we'll say things like IST or SST. If I'm using any of them today and you're not sure what I said, please put it in the chat and I'll clarify it. But basically, we're going to be talking about those two pieces. We're going to talk about the individual education plan, which is the IEP. We're going to talk about a process called Identification Placement Review Process. That's an IPRC. And we are going to talk about something, it's a special process that we have in TDSB called a Special Education Program Recommendation Committee process. We call that an SEPRC. All the things, this slide's just in here to just remind us all that all the processes that we have in TDSB all come from the Ministry of Education. So the Ministry of Education mandates different pieces of legislation around special education and assessment. And we use different documents along the way to guide us in what we do. So the Ministry of Education Learning for All is one of the documents that we use. All these documents can be found both on the TDSB website and on the ministry website. In Learning for All, there's some beliefs, and TDSB has the same shared beliefs as many of these things that are listed in Learning for All, but just to highlight a few of them, all students can succeed. And that's one thing that personally I believe, and TDSB is an advocate for, that all students have the ability to succeed and achieve. Each student, though, has their own unique pattern of learning, their strengths, their needs, when they're ready. So yes, everybody is able to achieve, but everybody has their own ways of coming at that. We also truly believe that successful instructional practices need to occur for students to achieve, and they're all based on proper pedagogy and proper research that's out there. And that we also believe that teachers, the homeroom teachers, assume the ownership of all their students in their class. So teachers are responsible to teach everyone that's in their class. And the last piece is a very important piece, and you'll hear it throughout the presentation, is that special education is not a destination. So a lot of times people talk about special education, they think of it as a room, like down the hall. Your child's in special education. Special education is not a destination. And again, all children can learn. So one of the documents we also look into is Growing Success. So Growing Success is our assessment, evaluation, and reporting procedures that's mandated by the Ministry of Education. And in it, it states very clearly that every school must have a procedure in place to identify the level of development, the learning abilities, and the needs for every child to ensure that we are programming for them effectively. So every school has to have a procedure in place. In the TDSB, we mandate those procedures and schools follow through them. In TDSB, we have something called a TDSB Special Education Plan. This plan, you can get it, there's a link in here. So if you get the PowerPoint, you'll be able to just click on it. But if not, if you check the TDSB website, just type in special education in a search, or in the parent section, I think it has special education plan in there. And everything we're talking about it is in the plan. So the first piece we're going to talk about today is an IST and an SST process. Usually you have an IST first, The second part is the SST. The IST, again, stands for In-School Support Team Meeting, okay? After that meeting would be the SST, the School Support Team Meeting. So well, I'll explain the two processes, but there's two different pieces. And this whole procedure is around working together as a team, and that's staff, that's students sometimes, and it's definitely parents, working together to implement what strategies are the best for the student. So how does it begin? So say a student is experiencing some challenges, maybe some difficulties. These could be learning challenges, social, emotional, maybe attendance. There's lots of different things that could be happening. The first step is this: teacher and parent should be communicating. We do know that parents and guardians are the first teachers of their children. They're really important to be part of the conversation from the very beginning. So when there's an issue that arises or a challenge that a student might be having, or a parent feels that the student is having, then the parent and teacher should be communicating about that. There could be meetings, emails, phone calls. Just a quick note here, in secondary school, it's sometimes involved, sometimes it's not the whole room teacher, because especially in secondary school, you might have 4 to 8 teachers, depending on your model of your school, that you would connect maybe with a special education or the guidance department. So it might not be one teacher, it might be a representative from somebody. And also just a quick note that students are very involved usually at the secondary level in these meetings and processes. So the teacher will try a bunch of strategies. So teacher does, looks at the child, look at the child's strengths and needs, and decides, okay, here's some things I'm going to try. They might have a conversation with previous teachers. They might have look in the students' school records, what's worked in the past. They'll have the communication with parents. If things are still not working, or there's still questions, or the teacher feels that they need more support, then they may be referred, the student's name may be referred to what we call the In-School Support Team Meeting, the IST. The role of this meeting is to, again, give the teacher more strategies and supports. So at this meeting, it's school-based only. The people that are there are usually the teacher, the school administrator. If there's a special education teacher in the building, if there's anybody else that teaches the child, they might come. So this group comes together, they look at the child's strengths and the needs, they consider what the parents' conversation's been with the teacher and what they've shared. They try to problem solve. Then they start looking at, is there anything that we can do to support the student? They make some next steps. They might decide on an IEP. We're going to talk about IEPs later, individual education plans. But all this procedures is recorded on something we call the individual learning plan. So the individual learning plan is just a piece of paper that records who was at the meeting, what were the strengths, what are the needs, what are some of the strategies that were suggested. And in that, what happens is it all gets recorded, and you should get a copy. So this meeting shouldn't be happening unless you know what's happening, and you should have record of it later. This is not a meeting you generally come to, because it's more about the teacher saying to the professionals in the building, can we get together and can you help me out and give me some more strategies? But you do know about the meeting, and you always get a copy. Hopefully, through that procedure, people are feeling supported, and things are successful after that. We look at different type of approaches that the teacher can implement. If the teacher has tried more strategies, things are still falling apart, maybe the child is still struggling, maybe there's more information that needs to be shared with different professionals. So what it says in here is, once school staff have implemented and exhausted all the different strategies that we think we could try, then it could be a recommendation to go to what we call an SST. That's the school support team. So all the strategies have been tried, and now we're trying the school support team. School support team is very similar to an IST, the in-school, but there's a few other people that are there. So some of the same people again are the principal, the teacher, maybe a special education teacher. In secondary, there might be the guidance counselor. Also, who is invited is the special education department consultant or coordinator. So those are people that work. Our consultants have about 14 schools that they would go to these meetings at. So they don't always work at the school your child attends to, but they are involved just with those schools and they would be there. And sometimes, depending on the situation, they will also invite the school psychologist, the the OT, which is occupational therapy. The social worker might be there, speech and language therapist might be there. It just really depends on the school and the situation. Parents are always invited and encouraged to attend. And if you feel like it, you can bring someone. I know many times when I was in a school, parents would feel a little nervous because all these people are going to be there. You can bring someone. You can bring a friend. You can bring, a colleague. Maybe your child goes to a daycare and you want to bring the daycare person because they know your child really well. But you're always invited and always encouraged to come because really, again, we're still brainstorming. What's going on? What can we do to support? What's the best way to support the child? And other school staff might also come, and community agencies if the parent invites them. You will always know who's going to be there though, because you'll get an invitation. And at this meeting, very similar to the first meeting, we talk about the child's strengths, the child's needs. We consider, again, more interventions. Now that there's more people at the table, sometimes the psychologist might say, well, have you thought about this or have you thought about that? At this point, because you have all these people around, including yourselves as parents and guardians, we might come up with some other strategies. And at that point, we start looking at, okay, so who's going to do what? Do we need to do a reading intervention? What's that going to look like? What are the timelines? And it's all written down again in the ILP. And again, you get a copy. Sometimes at these meetings, they recommend an IEP, individual education plan, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And that could come out of that meeting. They also might refer for some professional work. So maybe a psychologist who would do an academic assessment, maybe social work, maybe speech language, maybe one of the other supports that we have in the community. So if something can come out of this, sometimes we recommend what we call an IPRC, Identification Placement Review Committee. And again, we're going to talk about that later. So these two first meetings are really sort of exploratory. What can we do? How can we strategize? What's the best way to meet the needs of the child? So before we go on to IEP, I'm going to stop sharing and see if you have any questions about that first step. Just remember that we are going to talk about the IEP and IPRC after. So I'm just going to stop sharing. I'm going to check the chat. Going into the chat. I can find it. Give me 1 second. Okay. Roshan, you have a question. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask? I don't see Roshan there. Where's Roshan? Give me 1 second, guys.
She asked if she could type it instead.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, you can type, you can speak. It's really up to you. So go ahead and type it. Thank you. Some of our questions too, while she's typing that, if they're very specific to your child, depending on how much time we have, we can stay on at the end and we can talk privately about that as well. Yep, go ahead and type it. Ah, perfect. Your son is in virtual school, a whole new thing this year. Have they started doing an IST or SST yet? Yes, they have. So at this point, we're still working through a little bit of the process around who's managing different special ed pieces in the virtual school. But the virtual school teacher will be starting any type of supports. So if the virtual school teacher has a question about the student, they'll obviously have conversation with you. If both of you think we need to go to an IST, and then they would, right, the way the procedure is right now, and again, we're just tightening it up right now, they connect back with your child's home school. So, my kids went to a school called Pelmo Park. So if my child was still in school, I would call the teacher would connect with the principal of that school, and he would then start the process for an IST. And then if we think we need to go to an SST, then the homeschool principal again would do that. So we are trying to tighten that up. There was a memo that went out last week, but definitely if you have any concerns and your child's in the virtual school, reach out to the virtual teacher. We're just getting the messaging out to them as well. There are virtual vice principals in charge of special ed, so they can also help guide you any questions. And if you're not sure who they are, I think they're online somewhere, so you can see who the virtual people are. Does anybody else have a question before we move? I was told it was the bricks and mortar. Yeah, that's the way the procedure is right now. The bricks and mortar school will be leading the process, just because if, depending on what happens throughout the year, if your child goes back, they need to have the information. But the virtual school teacher is the one that starts the process. I'm just reading the chats here. Does SST only happen in the process leading up to figure out how to support a child? Well, really, it's the formal piece of it. Like SST is a formal piece. You should like from the very beginning, there should be conversation about how to support the child. That happens even before an IST. But it is one of the processes leading up to how to support the child. But really, I mean, you don't need the meeting to figure that out. As a mom, when my girls were having difficulty, I just called the teacher and we had conversations. Does it happen every year? So this is from No More Bob 2. I like the name. The process, does the process happen every year? Does the SST, is that the question?
Sorry, my son obviously changed my name. Yeah, I was more thinking about, does SST happen every year, or is it just that process of possible? I mean, my son does have an IEP and he does have 2 exceptionalities. So will it only happen while we're figuring out how to support him, or is it going to happen every year?
So in SST specifically, I mean, if there were some more needs, if there were things that you needed, if you think it's important to go back, then you can always say to the school, we should have another SST. If the needs are being met, then you wouldn't necessarily go back, because the IEP would then guide all of his instruction. You'd just be meeting with the teacher about the IEP. But sometimes you'll have more questions, or either yourself or the parent or the teacher might feel that it's good to go back, because depending if the needs change. Does that make sense?
Yep, that makes sense. Yep.
Yeah, it's not like it's a structure. Like if you have an IEP, it's reviewed every year. At this time of year, actually, we've been doing it the last couple of weeks, and that's a review that happens every year. And then if they are IPRC, we'll talk about that after, there's a review every year as well. But you don't have to go back to an SST unless there's more information or you think it's important.
I'm just trying to figure out the process as a parent, rather than, I'm actually a special education teacher, but I'm in ISP, so very different.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to figure out the process as a parent, and I'm realizing that, when you change those hats, it's really very different and it's very hard. So I'm trying to wrap my head around it. So that's my context. Thank you.
No problem. Both my girls went, actually they're both, one's actually a teacher now and one is just finished university, but both my girls were special education students, and it is very different when you're in the role compared to being a parent. So I really respect that. And sometimes it doesn't make sense, or you'll be like, well, that doesn't sound right. And it is what it is. We can always chat about that sometime. But the SST, you don't have to go back. Like if you're happy with everything that's going on, the teacher's programming properly, the IEP is fine, you wouldn't go back to that. You wouldn't have to.
Thank you.
If you're not happy, then you might say to the teacher, hey, maybe we need to. Or if you think things need to change.
Well, I think we're still working out the kinks.
There you go.
Yeah. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, I don't see any more questions about that first piece, and that piece is just a bit of an overview about the initial pieces. So I'm going to start sharing the screen again, and we'll talk a little bit about IEPs, Individual Education Plan. And let's just check the timing. I think we're doing okay, which is good. Okay, so IEPs. So IEP again stands for Individual Education Plan. You'll hear people talking about IEPs all the time. My child's on an IEP. I don't want my child on an IEP. IEP. I want you to just kind of understand what they really are. Really, it's a plan to support students. And just like it says, it's an individual plan. It shouldn't be a cookie cutter plan, right? Generally, they're set out to support students who are experiencing significant difficulties meeting the expectations. That's usually what it's about. Not always, and I'll tell you about some of the exceptions after, but generally it's around that. It's also written if there's students who are having difficulty accessing the curriculum at grade level. And the other way too is around social and emotional needs that interfere with their learning. But we also have IEPs that we write for students, for instance, in our deaf hard of hearing classes, or even if the students have deaf hard of hearing needs on their own. It's nothing to do with the curriculum. They're actually doing okay, but we need to have that in there to make sure that happens. And we'll talk about the different types of IEPs, but generally they're in there so that we're following you have your report cards, you have all your guidelines that the ministry has given us around assessments and things. This plan is going to support students to access the information. Okay, so it's an individual plan. So IEPs, they're written for a couple different reasons, but there's a regulation out there, and again, it's written here at the top, and you can look online or on the board's website. But there's some legal obligations around IEPs. So the first one is if a student is actually deemed what we call exceptional, and we're going to talk about that in the IPRC process, they must have an IEP. So any student that has been IPRC'd and they're an exceptional student, they meet the criteria for the exceptional, they have to have an IEP. That's just part of the regulation. But we also develop IEPs for students who require some special education support. And then again, like we just talked about, maybe through the IST or SST, someone said, hey, maybe we should put this down on paper. The principal's responsible for implementing it. The teachers generally write it, but the principal's there to make sure that it's happening. And we try to communicate with lots of different people, but including parents. One thing that's of note, the last one, and it's usually an interesting topic, but parents don't have to give permission to have an IEP. As a principal, I always wanted to make sure the parents were on board with an IEP and understood why we were doing it. But technically, the way the regulation's written, they don't have to have parent permission to write the IEP. Now, I want to explain a little bit about IEPs. When they first started coming together years ago now, many years ago, a lot of people were writing IEPs for things like, my child needs a quiet space or extra time. Now, when we look at IEPs, we ask ourselves the question, something like a quiet space or extra time to write a test, is that something that we must do for the child to be successful? Is it something that should be different for any other child? And in our opinion, in the TDSB, something like extra time or quiet space is actually good teaching, right? For example, if you're working in a place and you say to your employer, I just need 5 more minutes to get this done. Your boss would probably say, yeah, okay, take 5 minutes. You don't need a special plan. That's just what it is. So we're trying to actually not write as many IEPs for things that are just good teaching practices, right? Now, if a child's 3-4 years below in their reading, they might need an IEP so that we can teach them at the level they're at to get them to the level they need to be at. So I just want to make sure that, a couple of years ago now, a lot of people were writing IEPs for things that I would consider just good teaching practices. And we can chat a little bit about that when we get to the chat section of our presentation. So in the development of an IEP, the parent, and if the student is 16 years or older, it's very important to remember that. If a child's like 17 or 18, there's a consultation piece. So right now, if your child already had an IEP, you have been sent home a consultation letter. This year, we've done it both remotely and not remotely through an email. And then it's developed. It's developed by the parent and the student if they have input. Teachers, principals, special education staff, anybody that has been supporting the child. And then once it's all written, the IEP is sent home. In the IEP itself, there's a bunch of different pieces to it. We look at the assessment data, what levels are the child's at. Again, we look at the child's strengths and their needs. Really important to focus on the strengths because the strengths is what's going to support the needs. So if a child is really good at technology, for instance, but they're having difficulty writing, their strength of technology is going to help their writing. So it's important to know both things. We look at program goals. So what are the goals for each of the subjects? We look at their current levels of achievement, where they're at. We look at an IEP to see if there's any exemptions that need to happen. And then there's different parts of the IEP that talk about accommodations modifications, and alternative curriculum. And I'm going to go through those last three because sometimes those are a little bit confusing. So accommodations. An accommodation is something that's given to a student so that the child can access the curriculum at the grade level. So for instance, if, oh, I just heard something there, sorry. If a child needs something to access the curriculum at their level, it's called an accommodation. You're not altering the grade. You're not altering the amount of expectations. They're doing everything. It's just something they need. So for instance, some of our students need large print. So they might have an issue with some visual issues. They need large print. That they're still, say they're in grade 3, they're still getting grade 3 work. They're still doing all the work everybody else is doing. They just need a larger font when they're getting their things. That's an accommodation, right? And we used to put all those accommodations around like extra time, strategic seating, things like that. We used to put those in there. And they still can be in there, but really those are just good teaching practices. So we try not to put as many of those in. So again, accommodations mean, so you can have an IEP that's accommodated only, and it's just around how the child's accessing the curriculum at grade level. And there's different types of accommodations. So there's instructional accommodations, the way we teach them, the environmental, what the environment needs to look at, and the assessment accommodations, how it is we're going to assess them. So for instance, some students, they need some technology, for instance. So when they're doing their assessments, they can actually get everything down that they know, or they need voice software because they know a lot up here, but they like writing is not working for them. So their assessment, the accommodation would be that they get to use technology. Now, modifications are a little bit different. Modifications are when you're actually changing the subject or the course to meet their needs. So you're either changing it to a different grade level, or you're reducing the number of expectations from the common curriculum. So for instance, if a child is in grade 5, but they're reading at a grade 2 level, you're not going to give them grade 5 reading expectations. That would just be frustrating. So what you do is you in the IEP, you have a modification. You're teaching them at a grade 2 or 3 level, trying to get them to catch up as quickly as possible. Okay, and sometimes it's around the number of the expectations as well. And then the last part was the alternative expectations. Alternative expectations are generally things like social skills, could be things around motor skills. And again, these are things that are different than if you're modifying their program. Some of our students are also on alternative curriculum. They're doing more functional academics, daily activities of daily living and communication. So those pages in the IEP would be reflective to those pieces. Okay, we're going to stop there because that's the next part's about the IPRC. So I'm going to stop sharing. We're going to talk a little bit about IEPs and see what the questions were in there. So I see here we have something in the chat. Oh, that person said that to me privately. So I'm going to talk to that person later privately about that. Okay, unless that person wanted to share the question. Anybody have a question about IEPs, when they're developed, how they're developed, how do you end one, how do you start one? Any questions around that? Karina says no. Well, that's good. That means I explained it well. That or you knew it all. Trying to see if there's any other questions about IEPs. No. Okay. What do you do if a student? What do you do if an IEP is not being followed? That's a very good question. So sometimes you'll see that there's an IEP and it says this is what the child needs and it's not being followed. Just like anytime you have any disagreement or conflict where you're like, okay, this isn't working well. One, you make an appointment with the teacher and you have conversation and say, well, what's going on? Why are these pieces not being met? Hopefully it's just misunderstanding, or maybe you're working towards something and you work it out at that level. If you're still not happy, like I said before, the principal is the person to ensure that the IEP is being followed. And so that's who I would go to next. You would talk to the principal and say, you know, I'm concerned. Sometimes it's a case, especially as our children get older, that some teachers are following it and some aren't, because sometimes that happens as they get into older grades. Maybe the teachers didn't know that your child's on an IEP. They should. I mean, that's part of the principal's responsibility. But that's what I would do. Hopefully that helps. You're welcome. Okay, I'm going to move into the IPRC. And Sanjeet, if you want, I can discuss your question after privately, or I can message you privately, but I got to keep moving here. Okay, so I'm going to share the part about the IPRC. Okay, so an IPRC, again, it's a regulation from the ministry. Sometimes people have questions about this. It's not like TDSB has to follow the certain guidelines that have been set out. We can make some of it our own, the procedures, but most things come right from the ministry. And this is one of them. It stands for Identification Placement Review Committee. So it's actually a committee. So when people say, oh, the child's going to IPRC, they're going to a committee of people. I don't know if I say in here, so let me explain. I'll explain it here. So the committee of people is the school principal that's not your principal. There's usually a psychologist that sits on it, and someone from the special education team, usually one of our coordinators. So that's the committee. So at the committee, there's a role that they play. They have to do a couple of things. The first thing is they look at the I. The I, it stands for identification. And that's the number one here, to determine if a student is exceptional. So if a student is exceptional, and again, if you're wondering what the exceptionalities there are in our special education plan, definitely on the website or on the ministry website. So is the child exceptional? If so, and it has to be the definition of the ministry and the TDSB, because sometimes some parents will say, well, they have this exceptionality, but there could be a diagnosis which is different than an exceptionality. So once they decide, once the IPRC determines that the child is exceptional, and this is done by listening to all the presentations, the parent comes, we decide two things. Is the student going to the placement? So that's the P part. Is it going to be regular class or is it going to be a special education class? So that's the committee. The committee decides two things, the I and the P. And this is how it's initiated. How, if you ever think, oh, I think my child needs to go to an IPRC. Basically, the school principal makes a referral through the SST. So they'll be at that SST meeting. Remember from like 20 minutes ago, we were talking about SST. And maybe there'll be conversation about, I think the student needs to go to an IPRC, needs to be formally identified. Generally, the parents are at that meeting, and nobody. This is one piece where if parents don't want it to go to IPRC, it won't go to IPRC. But parents are generally notified, but they're usually at the meeting that we're going to do this. You also, as a parent, can make a request that the principal go to an IPRC. So that's part of the legislation. So sometimes you might say, I think my child has needs, and the principal's like, no, it's okay, let's give it some more time, but you really feel like an IPRC needs to happen. You can actually make a formal request to the principal, and they must take your child to an IPRC. What happens is about 10 days before the IPRC, so say you have this SST meeting and everybody says, yes, let's go to an IPRC for the formal identification. It takes a couple of weeks usually, but 10 days before the IPRC date, you're going to get written notification of the time and the meeting place. It's usually not at your school. It's usually at the principal's school who's hosting it. The whole package, everything that every committee member is going to get is going to be sent to you. So you'll see all the reports that the committee get. And this is who would attend. It would be the parents, obviously yourselves, student if it's appropriate. And I know I had said earlier, if they're 16 and over, then they actually would be there for sure. But I've been to IPRCs where someone at age 10 is there. And they're there to advocate for themselves as well, which is it's an amazing thing. If the parent wants to bring a support person, just like at the SST meeting, they can bring someone to the meeting. And then the school staff come to present. It's usually the principal or vice principal, the teacher, and any other staff that might be appropriate. And definitely if there's any interpretations needed, then we would bring an interpreter. Sometimes parents will bring a friend that will interpret for them because they feel that that's more, I guess, makes them more comfortable. So what happens during the meeting? So during the meeting, the profile of the student is shared. So the teacher, the principal, and the parents will share all these pieces, the strengths, the needs, what's going on in the current classroom, and they'll review stuff that is in the package. There's lots of discussion that happens. The psychologist might ask questions. The chair, who is usually a principal, but not your principal, will ask questions. And then they'll look at all the different things and say, before they make a decision, they usually say to the parent, what are you thinking? Like you've wanted this meeting, or you've decided this was a good thing. What are you thinking? If the student's exceptional, which is generally what parents are interested in, because that's why they've come to the meeting, then the committee will consider what the parent's preference is. And if they meet criteria for a special education class, then that will be offered. But if a parent says, well, no, I just want regular class, then that's what will be offered. Okay, and all that's recorded on what we call the statement of decision, and parents get that. Once in a while, parents can't come to this meeting. Something comes up. I mean, we're all very busy people. The meeting can still proceed with your permission, but no decision is made, right? You have to sign final paperwork. Like nobody can force your child into a program. Nobody can force your child to take an exceptionality. So if regular class is decided, because that happens many times, we have different levels of support in regular class. We have indirect support, where a student receives support from just the classroom teacher, but they might consult with a special ed teacher about their IEP. We have resource assistance, and usually what happens there is that there's a special education teacher that will come into the room and support the student in the class. And then there's withdrawal, just like the name, they're taken out, and that can be up to half the day. And then there's also different things. If we say, no, we're suggesting a special education class. There's two types. One of them is a partial integration class. That's most of our classes, where the students are in there for at least half the day, but they do get integrated for certain classes. So for instance, maybe it's a class with students with autism, and they're in there for most of the day, but they get integrated in for gym, music, and French into the regular program. We also have special education classes that are full-time, and that's where they're together the whole time in the program for the full day. So we just have to sometimes make a decision on what type of class the child needs. So at the IPRC, the decision will be made. And again, the parents can decide, and you don't have to decide on the spot. Sometimes parents feel pressured at the meeting. And I always, when I run IPRCs, say, please take it home, think about it, talk to people you trust, make a decision. But you're basically deciding on two things, the exceptionality and then the placement. And then you would sign it. But just to go back to that, the exceptionality, again, most parents are okay with the exceptionality because they usually have understood the process before they come. Around the placement, parents sometimes get held up on that because they want to know where the placement is. At the IPRC, the committee members don't know where the spots are. They can't, we don't know where they are. When I sit in the committee, we have to go back to the special education department and say, where are their spots? When you're signing yes for the placement at an IPRC, what you're signing is that an offer will come. Then what happens in usually about a week or so, your principal gets a call and they say, hey, this is where the placement is. Let's go for a visit. Then you sign, do you want that school or not? So you can sign yes for exceptionality and yes for placement and decide not to go to the placement. And in fact, you can go to the placement, try it for a few months, and if it's not what you want, you always go back to your home school. Once the decision's made, the offer is made by the special education coordinator. So depending on the area of the city you live in, the coordinator looks at it and they'll make a decision on which intense support program, we call them ISPs, which is the closest one. Then you'll go for a visit and then you decide after that, like I said, if you want program or not. In most cases, transportation is arranged. The reason I say most cases, some of our exceptionalities, especially as the kids get older, they don't provide transportation. So that's something you can always ask at the meeting. Okay, we're going to talk about this special education other one in a second. So I think I'll check again for chats and then I'll talk about that last piece. So let me just stop sharing. Okay. Here we go. Let's see. So there's a question here. Do you have to request an SST meeting before going to IPRC? Generally, yes. The SST usually makes the decision to go to IPRC. As a parent, though, if you write a letter saying, I would like my child to go to IPRC, the principal does have to respond to that right away. And usually within 3 months, the IPRC happens. It's probably better to go to SSTs because then everybody's on board. Everybody's saying, okay, let's get this done. Will an IPRC happen when my child transitions to middle school? So I see the question there. So I'm assuming that the child is already exceptional. So if your child is exceptional and they're in a special education class, or even if they're not, every year there's a review. That's the R of the IPRC, right? Identification Placement Review Committee. Every year there's a review, especially when they're going from one school to another. So if your child is in a K-5 school and they're in a special education class, they will have a review usually in about February. And then the decision's made. Does the child still need the same level of support? Will they need more support, etc.? But every year there's a review for everybody that's IPRC'd. One of the interesting things too, I should mention, so if your child's exceptional, but they're in a regular program, but as they want to, so they went to an IPRC, they were exceptional, but you decided regular program. If you decide the following year that you'd like them to go to a special education class, you have to go back to an IPRC, a full IPRC, to get the placement put back on. Because basically when you say regular class, then you're not guaranteed a placement again. Hope that makes sense. There's a difference between exceptionality and diagnosis. What's the difference? A diagnosis is usually something that comes from a doctor. A diagnosis is something that, I'll give you an example. So a learning disability is a diagnosis. It can be done from a psychologist. But an exceptionality is different because there's different criteria. Or sometimes somebody will say, my child has ADHD. ADHD, attention deficit disorder, is a diagnosis. TDSB and the ministry doesn't have an exceptionality for that. So it's a little bit different. Also too, a student might have, anyway, there's lots of different examples, but I mean, we can talk specifically about it.
That answered my question. Perfect. Thank
you.
Okay. Thanks. You picked both of the diagnoses that I was thinking about too. So thank you.
Yeah, there's lots of discussion out there about ADHD and exceptionalities. Usually, if that's one of the diagnoses, it could be affecting something else, and then it's an exceptionality.
Okay. Thanks.
All right. Yes, I see your child's in an ISP. Yes, so definitely kids in ISPs, as they're moving from one school to another, always have, well, everybody has a review, but that's always a huge focus. So if you're ever worried about when the reviews are going to happen, if your child is IPRC'd, I would just remind the principal. I mean, especially this year with all the chaos that's happening all over the place. I mean, our consultants know exactly who's in which classes, and they know when it's their transitional years. So we usually do those first. The kids that aren't transitioning, unless a parent has said they want something different, we usually wait until like April or May to do them because they're not moving. So, all right. How do we get support for ADHD then? Good teaching pedagogy, 100%. ADHD is I mean, there are different levels also too of ADHD, and not every child profiles the same way. Okay, let me see. What is going on with my computer right now? What is this? Thank you. Yeah, if you have a child who has ADHD, there's some really good information out there for sure. And you can go to a school support team and have discussions, especially with the school psychologists. A lot of them are very versed in the type of strategies that teachers should be using to deal with students with ADHD, because there's some really great strategies out there. Most of those students can be programmed for in the regular classroom with good accommodations. Okay. Parents are involved with a review every year. Yes, you should be involved with a review every year. I know with both of my daughters, usually what happened is a letter came home if my younger daughter remembered to bring it home, because she didn't always remember to bring the letter home, part of her exceptionality. But if a letter comes home and it asks you, especially if it's non-transitional year, do you want to have a review this year, or do you want to waive the review? Usually if you're fine with the placement, if there's no new information, I mean, you wouldn't have to have a formal review. with all the people around the table because you're okay with that. I would still have meetings with the teacher and have discussions about how they're doing, but you don't have to. But you should, you must be invited to a review, and you can decide to waive it or not. When kids are moving from one school to another school, we say that you can't waive it. We want you to come to the meeting because we want to have discussion. Is it, especially if your child's been in a placement for a couple of years, maybe it's time to try regular class, right? And in TDSB now, I mean, we are trying really hard to do more inclusionary work. We should have started with that from the beginning, but I will talk about that for sure. I'm just reading the rest of the question here. So last year was an interesting year. We still did all the reviews. From what I understand, from the special education level, so those would be the ones where the kids were moving schools. We did the reviews. If the child's in a school but they're staying in the program or in a regular program, that's the principal that's supposed to call for those reviews. So if they didn't have it, then I mean, you can always talk to the principal and say, you could do a review anytime. You could do a review tomorrow if you felt like it, although you probably can't get everybody together on a Sunday. So, okay. All right, I'm going to share that last part because I do know we only have about 10 minutes left. And then if there's any following questions, we can do that. Give me one more second. Okay. So this is now for most of you, and not everybody, because I've done this presentation before, not everybody is already in the TDSB, but this is a procedure outside if your child's outside of the TDSB, although you may have a child who's younger, who's not in the TDSB yet. So this process was put together, oh my goodness, I want to say almost 10 years ago now, but I'm not sure if it's that long, but a while ago to support families coming in whose child might have special education needs, but hasn't started TDSB yet. So I'm going to give you an example. Say you have a child, for instance, who has some developmental needs. They're coming from another board, maybe another province, and they've always been in a special education class, and their needs are such that they couldn't even start in a regular class for a short amount of time. Because you can imagine there's some students that would come in that might need more support than a regular class. And by the time you get the kid in and get the paperwork together and get the meeting, it could be a good 3-4 weeks before this child's in a proper placement. So we started this process, and it's basically for students who are not attending TDSB yet. So sometimes it's our little JKs coming in, especially from some of our special education daycares, and they're going to need a high degree of support in special education. So we're not talking kids that could manage for a few weeks until we can do an IPRC. Basically, what happens is the parent goes to the home school, wherever the school is where they live, and says, you know what, my child may have some needs that maybe can't be met in the regular program. We really are this year trying very hard to really dig down on that. What does that mean that they can't manage? What supports can we put in place so that they could manage even for a little bit? Let's give it a go and see what it works. But there will be some students that it might not be possible. So the principal might consult with the SST, the school support team. And if everybody's feeling like, yes, this is definitely a student that has exceptional needs that can't be met at all in the regular program, then they'll sometimes ask the special education consultant to come in to do an observation, depending on the reports that the parent provides, right? Sometimes it's very evident, and sometimes we're not sure. And then if we think that this is a child that would meet criteria for a special education program, then we complete this SEP-RC referral, Special Education Placement Review Committee. Then the parents are invited to the meeting, very similar to the IPRC. And again, parents get all the information. So from then on, it's almost the exact same as an IPRC. And then the meeting occurs. At that SEP-RC, we look at all the different types of paperwork that could have been already produced, similar to an IPRC. And there's 2 decisions that it makes. Interesting, compared to an IPRC, there's no I, there's no identification. This is just about placement, just about getting the kid into TDSB in the best spot. So we can make 2 decisions: intense support program, which is a special ed program, or the regular class. I should mention there, because we're almost at the end, that in a SEP-RC, about 6 months later, 6 to 9 months later, they would go back to an IPRC to put the identification piece on, because by then we'd know the child. And that is the end of the PowerPoint. I'm going to go back to the questions, and we still have a few minutes for even open questions. Okay, so I don't see any other questions yet. Are there any questions? We have a whole 6 minutes. That's not bad. I was a little bit worried about the timing there, although I do speak quick. And as I said at the beginning, in case people weren't on, this is being recorded and we're hoping that it'll also be posted. But if anybody individually wants a copy of it, I can always send it to them as well. But any other questions, my friends? I don't see any in the chat. Anybody? I do. Yep. Okay. Go ahead, Roshan. Maybe Roshan's going to type it. You're welcome, Karina. We like Saturdays. It's a nice sunny day, but it's cold out there. Somebody wrote, right, the principal, are they obligated to let your child with exceptionality into the school? They must let your child in. No principal can say your child cannot come to the school. If you are hearing that message, it is not a message that is being supported at all by anybody at TDSB. If a parent says, I want my child in the regular program at their regular school, they must have them there. And we'll work through the details of how to support them. But no principal can say, well, I don't have enough support here. Your child can't come here. We'll figure that out through the superintendents, through the special education department. All students, that's our goal. All students are able to be at their regular program in the regular class. I hope that answered that question. And if you're hearing that and you're feeling that you're not being welcomed in the regular class, I would connect with either your trustee or the superintendent of the school. Have you heard any kids switching from virtual school to in-class? Lots. There's lots of kids switching. We did this big switch a couple of weeks ago, especially some of our kids with special education needs. They're having, not all of them, many though, are having a hard time with the virtual world. So a lot of them have switched back. But that has nothing to do with me. I don't get a say on that. There's a process. So if you're interested in switching your kids back to regular school, contact your homeschool principal. We are in a private learning pod, but we're being asked, we're being asked to leave due to behaviors. So you wanted to, yeah, just ask. The superintendent should be supporting those transfers back. I don't think they're letting anybody into the virtual school, but I think they're allowing people back, especially if your child's in a special education class already, because we did leave the staffing there because we knew that parents might want to come back. I know they say there's no switching. Talk to your superintendent. This last week has been a little bit crazy. At one point they said absolutely no switching, and recently I've heard depending on the request and why. And I know many of the meetings I was sitting on, superintendents said that if students have special education needs, they would look really closely at letting them return. Hope that helps. Any other questions? You can talk to me too. It's very lonely here. Have you granted exemptions to synchronous learning? So there's some people, oh, you're talking that synchronous learning, there was a portal or something you can click on and say that you want your child out of the synchronous. I'm not sure. I think it's open until the end of next week. I think it's open to the 30th. So I'm not sure who's going to get back to you about that piece. I'm not sure if there's any instructions on TDSB about it. But I know it's still open. I don't think anybody will say you must have your child in the synchronous. I think they just want to know your intentions. If you have any questions about virtual, whether your child's in virtual or in regular, your homeschool principal, the principal where your child's supposed to be, if this was a normal year, that they have all the answers. They should have all the answers, and if not, their superintendents do, for sure. All right, well, if there's no more questions, guys, it is 1:14. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Again, good luck. I'm glad you're interested in special education. There are lots of supports at schools, consultants, coordinators. There are lots of people that are there to support. So please reach out. Again, my name is Susan Moulton, in case you weren't at the beginning, Moulton. So again, it's if you're emailing anybody in TDSB, it's the same, first name dot last name at tdsb.on.ca. Or you can just ask your principal who the central principals are for your area. So I have one area, but yep, that's it there. Very good, Karina. I am the central principal for Learning Center 2, which is basically north of 401 between Islington and Kennedy. So if you have a very specific question about your child, I can always, as long as you tell me the school that your child goes to, I can always send it on to my counterparts in the other areas. All right. Thanks everyone. Have a great day.
Susan, you
All right.
too.